She married into one of America's wealthiest families and shot her husband dead in their mansion. Anne Woodward claimed it was an accident, but high society never believed her. So, was she a scared wife? Or a cold-blooded killer who got away with murder? Early life and escape from Kansas. Before the headlines and the scandal, before she was Anne Woodward, she was just Angeline Lucille Crowell. She was born on December 12, 1915, in the small town of Pittsburgh, Kansas. It wasn't the kind of place where big dreams felt possible, but it was where her story began. Her father, Jesse Crowell, had served in the Army but was long out of uniform by the time Angeline was born. After retiring from military life, he worked as a streetcar conductor in town. It was an ordinary job, but it gave him structure. Her mother, Ethel Smiley Crowell, was anything but ordinary for the time. She was a school teacher, and not just any teacher. She had earned a master's degree from the University of Kansas, back when very few women were even encouraged to finish high school. Ethel was smart, focused, and serious about education, but the home life behind the scenes didn't last. Angeline was still a child when her parents' marriage broke down. They divorced, which was rare and often looked down on in those days. The split left a mark. Both parents eventually remarried and moved on, but that chapter of her childhood stayed with her. It introduced her early to change, distance, and the quiet fractures that would later echo in her adult life. She stayed in Pittsburgh through her teen years, but she wasn't one to blend into the background. People noticed her. She was tall, graceful, and had a self-confidence that didn't match her small-town surroundings. Her looks set her apart, but her restlessness did too. Pittsburgh was the kind of place where people settled down early. Angeline wanted out. After graduating from high school, she took her first real step away. She moved about 150 kilometers north to Kansas City and enrolled at Kansas City Junior College. At first, it seemed like a smart path. She was following in her mother's footsteps, aiming for higher education. But it didn't last. After just 1 year, she left college behind. No one knew it at the time, but that decision would change everything. It wasn't just about leaving school. It was about leaving Kansas. She was 21 and tired of watching her life happen in slow motion. She wanted more. And there was only one place she believed she could find it. In 1937, with little money and no real connections, she packed a suitcase and caught a train to New York City. She didn't have a plan, but she knew what she was running from, a quiet, polite life that had already started to close in around her. What she was running toward was harder to name. Maybe it was fame. Maybe it was reinvention. Maybe it was the kind of freedom that didn't exist in Kansas. The timing was no accident. The country was still feeling the effects of the Great Depression, but in certain corners, especially Manhattan, there was a buzz coming back. Nightclubs were opening, radio shows were booming, and people were once again spending money on beauty, fashion, and entertainment. The city was ready to be dazzled, and Anne wanted to be the one to do it. Back in Kansas, people probably assumed she'd come home eventually, maybe with a new job, maybe with a husband, maybe with a few stories about the big city. But Anne wasn't interested in round trips. She had no plan to return. Pittsburgh had given her a beginning, but New York would write the next chapter, and it was going to be nothing like the one she left behind. Career and rise in New York. When Anne arrived in New York City in the late 1930s, she adopted the name Anne Eden and stepped into a world built on looks, charm, and timing. She landed a job as a nightclub showgirl at Fifi's Monte Carlo, one of the city's flashiest night spots. Located on East 54th Street, it was the kind of place where businessmen and Broadway regulars came to drink, dance, and be seen. Anne stood out instantly. Her blonde hair, sharp features, and confident posture turned heads nightly. In a city full of women chasing fame, she was one who actually stopped traffic. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. One night, John Robert Powers, founder of the Powerful Powers modeling agency, was in the audience. He spotted Anne and believed she had the kind of face that could sell anything. At the time, Powers had an eye for talent, and if he said someone could work, doors opened. He invited her in, and soon she was landing steady modeling jobs. Photographers liked her because she followed directions and had a natural ability to hold a camera's attention. Her images started appearing in fashion ads and magazine spreads. That led to even more work, and more importantly, more visibility in New York's social scene. Anne's transition from the dance floor to the radio mic wasn't a stretch. She had already become known in nightlife circles, and her voice, crisp and commanding, was well suited for the airwaves. Her next step came through Noel Coward, the celebrated British playwright and entertainer. Coward had written a popular musical called Set to Music and was bringing a radio version of it to American audiences. He cast Anne in one of the recurring roles. Her job wasn't huge, but it was consistent, and she made the most of every line she delivered. The show was broadcast nationally. At a time when radio was still king, a recurring spot on a Coward production wasn't just good, it was career-changing. It gave her a reputation in the entertainment world beyond modeling and nightlife. She wasn't just a pretty face anymore. She had stage presence and voice control that worked live. The exposure added a new layer to her image and gave her access to an entirely different tier of society, people who worked behind the scenes, and people who could offer something more permanent than applause. By 1940, Anne had achieved something that many actresses with more training hadn't. She was named the most beautiful girl in radio, a title that felt ironic since radio had nothing to do with looks. But in Anne's case, it made sense. She represented the fusion of voice, charm, and elegance, exactly the kind of persona sponsors like to promote. Being given that title wasn't just about flattery, it came with real perks. She got new hosting offers, social invites from industry leaders, and access to circles that most performers never got near. Outside the studio, she was becoming a familiar name in social columns. Writers loved her because she was photogenic, knew how to pose, and had a bit of mystery to her. She didn't give interviews easily and didn't offer many personal details, which only increased interest in her. She appeared at charity events, gallery openings, and fashion showcases. Publicists used her face to sell perfume, jewelry, and furs. Every move she made was watched and copied. The real advantage of her rising fame wasn't the jobs or the press. It was the network. Anne became connected to the people who ran the city quietly: art dealers, agents, media heads, and old money families. Her name started appearing next to theirs in the paper, not just in society pages, but in event invites and guest lists. She was building a place for herself far beyond the stage or the microphone. Anne knew how to use her image to unlock doors. She didn't overstay her welcome in one area of the industry. She moved with purpose, from nightclubs to print ads to radio and into society without ever looking like she was trying too hard. Her early career in New York wasn't about overnight fame. It was about steady growth and smart moves. One opportunity led to another, and she made sure each step brought her closer to real influence. That influence would eventually open doors that were rarely open to women with small-town roots. Her work in radio gave her something few other showgirls had: credibility. Not just with the public, but with people who mattered. Directors, producers, and society hosts saw her as more than background entertainment. By the time she reached her mid-20s, she had made enough of a name to be recognized outside the club scene. And that recognition carried weight in a city where most names disappeared as fast as they arrived. For a while, it worked. Meeting the Woodwards. Anne Eden was already making waves in New York nightlife when she first crossed paths with William Woodward Jr. She had rebranded herself, carved out a name in radio, and was now working the glamorous club scene. That was where she met William, young, rich, and the future heir to one of America's most powerful banking families. William Jr. wasn't just another well-dressed man at the bar. He came from serious money. His family had deep roots in finance, and their name carried weight in horse racing too. The Woodwards weren't just wealthy, they were part of America's elite. His father, William Woodward Sr., was a towering figure in both the business world and the world of thoroughbreds, running Bel Air Stud, one of the oldest and most successful racing stables in the country. But rumors about Anne's connection to the Woodwards didn't begin with William Jr. For years, high society circles whispered that Anne had originally caught the attention of William Sr., not the son. The senior Woodward was nearly 40 years older than Anne, but gossip claimed they had been romantically linked. No photos, no proof, but the story stuck. Some believed Anne had first built a relationship with the father before shifting her focus to the son. Others said the entire story was invented by those who couldn't stand the idea of an outsider like Anne stepping into old money territory. Either way, once she and William Jr. started spending time together, the whispers got louder. Their relationship didn't follow a neat timeline. When they first met, William Jr. was still in his late teens. Anne was older by 5 years, and at that time she already had a foothold in the city's entertainment scene. They had a few early encounters, but things remained casual. The dynamic started to shift after America entered World War II. William enlisted in the United States Navy, just like thousands of other young American men. Their budding connection was paused by war, but the distance didn't break it. Despite the separation, their bond grew. They exchanged letters and kept in touch. William was stationed away, involved in active service, while Anne remained in New York, continuing her career. When William got a short leave in March 1943, he returned with one goal. He proposed. Anne said yes. It wasn't a long engagement. Just 2 weeks after popping the question, the couple got married while William was still on shore leave. Their ceremony wasn't a grand event. With the world at war and William's return to duty looming, there wasn't time for big celebrations. They tied the knot quickly and quietly, knowing that uncertainty waited on the other side. Later that year, William was deployed aboard the USS Liscum Bay, a U.S. escort aircraft carrier operating in the Pacific. In November 1943, the ship was hit by a Japanese submarine torpedo near the Gilbert Islands. The explosion was massive. Ammunition stores ignited, and the ship sank within minutes. Over 640 crew members were killed in the attack. It was one of the deadliest single-ship losses for the United States Navy during the war. But somehow, William survived. He was pulled from the ocean, badly injured but alive. He was one of just 272 survivors from a crew of more than 900. His survival was considered miraculous. When he returned to the U.S., he received a Purple Heart. Newspapers covered the story. He was praised for his resilience, and his return made headlines across the East Coast. Back in New York, Anne was waiting. She had gone from being a rising radio personality to the wife of a war hero. Their marriage, born during a global conflict, was now tied to a story of near death and survival. The press celebrated them as a couple. Their photos appeared in magazines. Her beauty, his background, and their wartime love story made them media darlings. They were invited to charity galas and public events, and doors that were once closed to Anne began to open. People saw them as a perfect post-war couple, young, good-looking, and linked to both glamour and American grit. Anne wasn't just another model or radio voice anymore. She was Mrs. William Woodward, Jr., wife of a naval officer with a headline-making survival story. But while the newspapers printed their wedding photos and the world cheered for William's return, the real story of how Anne entered the Woodward dynasty wasn't one society could easily accept. Some never got past the rumors about William's father. Others questioned why a young man from one of the oldest banking families would fall for a nightclub showgirl with no name, no family fortune, and a reputation for working rooms. These doubts would follow Anne for the rest of her life. Still, for that moment in time, Anne was on top. She had a high-profile husband, a new last name, and the kind of visibility she had chased since her Kansas days. She'd escaped the Midwest, conquered New York radio, and now married into one of America's oldest fortunes, all before turning 30. Family life and private tensions. By the summer of 1944, Anne and William had welcomed their first child, a boy named William Woodward III. 3 years later, they had another son, James. With 2 healthy children, a sprawling estate, and more money than most could dream of, they looked like the perfect post-war family. Photographs from the time show them smiling at charity events, dressed to the nines, blending in with New York's most powerful families. Their names were often printed in the society pages. They showed up to horse races, theater openings, and glamorous galas at places like the Waldorf Astoria and the Plaza. From the outside, the Woodwards seemed like they had it all. William was continuing his family's legacy in horse racing and banking, and Anne had transitioned easily into her new role as a society wife. There were designer clothes, elite parties, and vacations that most people would never experience. But inside the walls of their Oyster Bay estate, things were not nearly as polished. The marriage had problems from the beginning. Anne was never fully accepted by William's family. His mother, Elsie Woodward, had made her disapproval known early and often. She saw Anne as someone who didn't belong in their world. No amount of charm or effort could change that. Anne was always an outsider to her mother-in-law, and the tension between them rarely eased. William Jr., on the other hand, was under enormous pressure. He came from one of the wealthiest families in America, and he knew what was expected of him. He was raised to be polished, controlled, and perfect. Anne, who had worked her way into the social elite from a Kansas childhood and nightclub jobs in New York, had a different energy. She was ambitious, proud, and not interested in playing small. The differences between them became clearer as the years passed. They started to drift apart. Both of them spent more time away from home, sometimes together, but often alone. William traveled for work and racing, and Anne stayed behind or made appearances at social events without him. Whispers about affairs began to float around their social circles. Anne had her suspicions, and so did William. Eventually, suspicion turned into acceptance. They stopped hiding it. Everyone in their world knew what was happening, but no one said anything out loud. Affairs were just part of the lifestyle for people in their tier of society. It didn't make headlines, it made conversation behind closed doors. Anne started drinking more during this time. What began as social drinking became a regular habit. She also leaned on prescription medications to cope with anxiety and sleepless nights. In a time when mental health wasn't openly discussed, especially among high society women, Anne did what many others did. She numbed it quietly. She was expected to look elegant, act composed, and smile in public, even when she was falling apart privately. As her dependence grew, so did the emotional distance between her and William. They fought more often and started sleeping in separate rooms. Their home was large enough for space, but not large enough to avoid tension. Staff members noticed the mood shifts and unspoken arguments. Friends began to comment that something about Anne had changed. She still looked beautiful and kept up appearances, but there was a kind of edge in her voice now. She could be sharp, impatient, even paranoid. Meanwhile, William began to spend more nights away from home. His interests were split between his professional responsibilities and his personal distractions. He didn't try to fix the marriage, he simply moved through it, distracted and disconnected. For William, the structure of his upbringing taught him not to show emotion or admit problems. For Anne, being ignored was worse than being criticized. Their sons, William III and James, were kept away from the worst of it. They had nannies, tutors, and everything they could ask for on paper. But children are observant. They notice when their parents stop looking at each other, or when silence fills a room where laughter used to be. Anne was fiercely protective of them, but her own unraveling made it hard to create the calm home life she wanted. Anne had tried to fit in with the women of her social rank, but the divide never fully closed. They saw her as someone who had married into the club rather than someone born into it. Even when she hosted dinners and attended galas with the right people, the sense of being not quite one of us lingered. The more she felt watched or judged, the more pressure built. And the more pressure built, the more she turned inward. The Woodward family looked like they were living a dream, but the dream had cracks that everyone close to them could see if they dared to look closely. The night of the shooting. On October 30th, 1955, Anne and William Woodward arrived at one of the year's most exclusive parties. The host was Florence Tucker Baker, a well-connected banking heiress. The guest list read like a tabloid dream. Even the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were there. Wallis Simpson and the former King Edward VIII, still a headline-making pair years after he gave up the throne for her. The Woodwards weren't just another wealthy couple showing up to make small talk. They stood out. Anne walked in wearing a silver blue gown with a matching wrap. William, always polished, kept close by. To outsiders, they looked elegant, but they had barely spoken on the drive over. Behind the glitz and champagne, things were tense. For weeks, there had been talk of strange activity around their Oyster Bay Cove estate. Neighbors whispered about suspicious noises and figures spotted around nearby homes. One neighbor claimed he saw someone climbing a tree near the Woodwards' house. Anne and William had already taken precautions. She had started keeping a loaded shotgun in her bedroom. They had begun locking every window before going to sleep. At the party, Anne told a friend she was still worried about the rumors. She didn't drink much that night and kept checking her watch. William, meanwhile, spent most of the evening by the bar, chatting with friends. By the time they left, Anne looked exhausted. They arrived home after midnight. The house was still. Their staff had gone to bed. William and Anne walked through the house together, checking doors and windows. Nothing seemed out of place, but Anne insisted on sleeping with the shotgun nearby, just in case. The couple didn't share a bedroom. William went to his own room down the hall, and Anne closed her door and changed into a nightgown. It was sometime around 2 a.m. when Anne said she was startled awake by a loud sound. She thought it came from the roof or possibly the hallway outside her room. Her heart raced. The stories about prowlers came rushing back. She grabbed the shotgun from beside her bed. Anne opened her door slowly. The hallway was dark. She stepped out barefoot, listening. Then she saw movement. A shadow passed near the doorway to William's room. She raised the shotgun, pointed toward the figure, and fired. The sound of the blast echoed through the house. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then Anne reached for the hallway light switch and flipped it on. What she saw next would stay with her for the rest of her life. William was on the floor, a few feet outside his bedroom. He had been hit in the head. The blast hadn't just grazed him, it had killed him. She later said she didn't even realize it was him at first. The hallway had been dark, and she said she fired at what she thought was a stranger breaking into their home. She dropped the gun and rushed to him. Then she ran to the nearest phone and called the police. When they arrived, she was still wearing her nightgown, pale and shaking. Officers found the shotgun lying near the hallway wall. The body of William Woodward lay where he had fallen. The hallway rug was stained. The house staff woke up to flashing red lights in the driveway. Word spread quickly. By morning, reporters had already gathered outside the gate. The story was too shocking to ignore. The young heir to one of America's richest families had been shot in his own home, and his wife had pulled the trigger. The headline practically wrote itself. Anne stayed inside the house, answering police questions. She kept repeating the same story. She had thought an intruder was breaking in. She was afraid. She never meant to hurt anyone. It was a mistake. But the details of the night stuck with people. The party, the rumors of prowlers, the separate bedrooms, it all felt strange. Some pointed to the fact that the couple had gone to sleep in different rooms after an elegant night out. Others asked why Anne hadn't called for help before firing. Why did she shoot so quickly? No one had those answers, but the facts of that night became the foundation for everything that followed. Anne's life and reputation would never be the same. Investigation and public reaction. Within days, she was summoned to appear before a grand jury in Nassau County. The case had already started making headlines, and people across the country were watching closely. The fact that the Woodwards were wealthy and part of the old money elite made the story even more sensational. Some reporters even began calling it the shooting of the century. But for the jury, the focus was on whether Anne had acted deliberately or whether it really had been a terrible mistake. What helped Anne's case was the sudden arrest of a man named Paul Worths. He had been picked up by the police in connection with a string of break-ins across Long Island. During questioning, Worths admitted that he had been prowling around the Woodward estate the very night of the shooting. He said he had even climbed onto the roof and heard someone moving inside just before the gun went off. After that, he fled. His confession lined up almost perfectly with Anne's version of the events, giving real weight to her story. The grand jury met in early November. They listened to Anne's testimony, reviewed the forensic reports, and heard the statement from Worths. It didn't take long, just under half an hour, for them to reach a decision. The shooting had been a tragic accident. Anne would not face criminal charges. The court had spoken. But outside the courtroom, the reaction was anything but calm. Among New York's upper class, the jury's decision didn't carry much weight. From the moment the news of the shooting broke, Anne had been viewed with suspicion. Her glamorous background, her showgirl past, and her entrance into the powerful Woodward family all became points of attack. Many in high society had never accepted her to begin with. They now claimed the shooting wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. The gossip picked up quickly. One story said Anne and William had been on the brink of divorce. According to whispers in private drawing rooms and exclusive dinner parties, Anne had everything to lose if they separated. William had inherited millions after his father died, and the couple owned multiple properties. If she walked away without a solid divorce settlement, she would have lost access to that fortune. That made the shooting look a lot more calculated to those who already saw her as a gold digger. Some of William's closest friends added fuel to the fire. They began leaking stories to the press about his unhappiness and hinted that he had been planning to leave Anne for good. One even claimed that William had already contacted a divorce attorney. These claims weren't backed up with real proof, but in the court of public opinion, they were enough. The idea that Anne had acted out of fear slowly gave way to a darker theory, that she had used the break-in as a cover to get rid of her husband before he could get rid of her. Anne had gone from being the most beautiful girl in radio to being the most talked-about woman in New York, and not in a good way. The same people who had once toasted her at parties now refused to return her calls. Public sympathy dried up fast. She wasn't seen as a grieving widow. She was seen as someone who had outplayed the system and walked away untouched. While the legal process had wrapped up, the public reaction had only just begun. The court might have closed the case, but New York's elite kept the whispers alive, and those whispers would shape Anne's future far more than any verdict ever could. Isolation from society. Her mother-in-law, Elsie Woodward, played a central role in keeping Anne on the outside. Elsie had never accepted her. Long before the shooting, she had made her disapproval clear, calling Anne a gold digger and doing everything in her power to push her out of the family. After William's death, Elsie's criticism only became more public. She kept talking about the scandal behind closed doors and made sure others kept talking about it too. In society circles, whispers traveled fast, and they all led back to the same place: Anne's reputation. Even though she remained wealthy and still lived in luxury, Anne disappeared from the social scene. For over a decade, she stopped attending parties, fundraisers, or society luncheons. These events were once her stage, and now she wasn't invited or didn't dare to show up. If she did, the mood would shift. People would glance, whisper, or politely excuse themselves. She wasn't just ignored, she was treated like she didn't belong. Anne chose to live alone and kept a low profile. Her homes were elegant, but there was no more flash or fanfare. Photographers no longer followed her, and newspapers didn't report on her outfits or public appearances. There were no appearances to cover. She stayed in, away from attention. The loud glamour of her earlier years faded into silence. Her world became smaller. But her name stayed in rotation. It showed up in gossip columns, never kindly. Even when she wasn't seen, she wasn't forgotten. The scandal had made her famous, and now it followed her everywhere, even in her absence. Whenever people talked about dramatic society tales or unsolved mysteries, Anne's name was right there. She had become shorthand for scandal. Some of her former friends tried to distance themselves. Others vanished from her life completely. Only a few close companions remained, and even they rarely spoke of her in public. For a woman who once climbed her way to the very top of Manhattan's elite, the silence was louder than words. Anne never gave interviews about the shooting again. She never wrote a memoir or appeared in documentaries. The story stayed frozen in time, and she didn't try to reshape it. Whether that was out of shame, fear, or exhaustion, no one really knew. But it kept her isolated. Over the years, her loneliness became obvious. Her sons grew up, but her relationship with them wasn't often talked about. She didn't remarry. She didn't re-enter society with a new look or new partner. She remained a widow both by title and by the way she lived. People saw her wealth as protection, but it couldn't buy back her place among the elite or the sense of belonging she once had. Even in places where she wasn't known personally, her reputation followed. Mention her name at a dinner table and someone always had a take. Someone knew someone who had been at that party or at the trial or in the same club years before. That kind of gossip doesn't fade. It passes down like a family story. And still, she stayed quiet. She never tried to reclaim the spotlight. Maybe she knew it wouldn't work. Maybe she didn't want to try. Whatever the reason, Anne Woodward lived out those years in silence. Her name never fully disappeared from the public, but the woman behind it did. She faded behind the scandal, behind the headlines, behind the locked doors of a world she used to rule. Truman Capote and renewed controversy. However, in 1975, Anne Woodward's name suddenly resurfaced in the public eye, but not because of any new investigation, legal battle, or even an interview. It came from a magazine article. That year, famed author Truman Capote released excerpts from his long-anticipated novel, Answered Prayers, in Esquire magazine. The piece that caused the biggest stir was titled La Côte Basque, 1965. It wasn't a confession, a memoir, or a tell-all, but it read like one. Capote had spent years moving through New York's elite circles, charming the socialites known as his swans. These were wealthy, powerful women like Gloria Vanderbilt, Babe Paley, and Slim Keith. Capote attended their parties, listened to their secrets, and blended into their world. But in the end, he didn't stay loyal. In La Côte Basque, he thinly disguised real people as fictional characters, exposing things they thought were off the record or too far in the past to matter. One of those characters was Anne Hopkins, a clear stand-in for Anne Woodward. In the story, Hopkins is portrayed as a glamorous but cold woman who killed her husband in order to secure his fortune. The description didn't leave much room for interpretation. The details lined up with Anne's real life, including the suspicious circumstances surrounding her husband's death 2 decades earlier. Capote and Anne weren't close. They didn't move in the same circles after the shooting, and they had never been known to be friends. But that didn't stop him from using her as material. He had likely picked up stories secondhand, from gossip, from social acquaintances, or from reporters who still remembered the case. He stitched together facts and rumors, turned them into fiction, and dropped them into the middle of an explosive chapter. Anne found out about the chapter before it hit the stands. Someone warned her about what Capote had written. It wasn't just a passing mention. It was a direct hit. She knew the piece would stir up everything she had spent years trying to escape. She had been living a quieter life, out of the spotlight. Public interest in the shooting had faded. People had moved on. But Capote's story dragged it all back. For Anne, the thought of being put on display again wasn't just upsetting. It was overwhelming. The chapter painted her as a scheming woman who had pulled the trigger for money. It didn't matter that she had never been charged. It didn't matter that the courts had cleared her. What mattered was how she would be seen. Capote had reopened the case in the court of public opinion, and this time she had no way to defend herself. The timing made everything worse. The 1970s were full of new media attention on true crime and scandal. Capote's story wasn't just published and forgotten, it made headlines again. Newspapers and gossip columns picked it up. High society started whispering. People who hadn't thought about the Woodward case in years were now revisiting every theory, every photo, every courtroom detail. Some believed the story was true, others were just interested in the drama. But the damage was done either way. Capote never gave Anne a heads up himself. He didn't explain the choice or offer her a chance to respond. For him, it may have been about art, storytelling, or getting attention for his book. But for Anne, it felt like a personal attack. She had spent 20 years trying to move past the worst night of her life. Now, she was being cast as a villain in a story she didn't write. The publication of La Côte Basque 1965 didn't just reignite public interest in Anne's past, it brought a new layer of humiliation. She was no longer being talked about in legal terms. She was being fictionalized, picked apart, and sold as entertainment. Death and aftermath. But in October 1975, just before the chapter was going to be published, Anne Woodward was found dead in her apartment. She had been warned in advance about what was coming. Word had already reached her that Truman Capote's upcoming piece for Esquire would use her as a model for one of his thinly veiled characters. He hadn't changed the story much. In the chapter La Côte Basque, 1965, he told a fictionalized version of the 1955 shooting. His character, Anne Hopkins, bragged about killing her husband to get his money. It wasn't subtle. Everyone who knew the real Anne immediately recognized her in it. Truman Capote, once the darling of New York's literary and social elite, suddenly found himself on the outside. His friends, especially the women he had depended on for stories, gossip, and dinner invitations, felt betrayed. They had trusted him. They had included him in their private lives. And now, in Answered Prayers, he had exposed their secrets in print, hiding them behind the thinnest layer of fiction. Anne's chapter wasn't the only one, but it was the most talked about. Capote had gambled with his career, assuming that the shock would turn into buzz, and buzz would turn into success. But the reaction wasn't what he expected. He was cut off by nearly everyone. No more invitations, no more phone calls, no more long lunches at the colony with Manhattan's richest families. They weren't amused, they were angry, and most of them never forgave him. Capote had always thrived on attention. He loved to be the center of a room. But after La Côte Basque came out, the rooms got smaller. Eventually, they disappeared altogether. His behavior became erratic. He had already been drinking heavily, and his health was starting to spiral. By the time he died in 1984, nearly a decade after Anne, the charming and sharp-witted writer people once admired was long gone. Anne's story didn't fade away either. After her death, old rumors came roaring back. People started revisiting the events of 1955. They brought up the party, the shotgun, the separate bedrooms, and the timing of the shot. Some argued it had always been an accident, just like the court had decided. Others claimed it was premeditated. But either way, her name was pulled back into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Even people who had never met her started to weigh in. Her wealth, her background, her ambition, they all became talking points again. No one seemed to care that she had been cleared legally. Her reputation had never recovered, and death didn't change that. The damage from Capote's story didn't end with Anne. The shockwaves spread through her family. Her sons had grown up in the shadow of the scandal, and the constant suspicion and whispers followed them for years. One of them, James, died 3 years after Anne. Her other son, William III, died in 1999. Both struggled with personal battles that seemed to trace back to the night their father was killed. By the time the full version of Answered Prayers was published posthumously in 1986, the people it had targeted were either dead, in exile, or had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with Capote ever again. What was meant to be his masterpiece ended up being a slow-motion fallout, taking down relationships and reputations with it. In 2024, decades after all of them were gone, the story got a second life. Feud, Capote versus. The Swans brought the events back into focus for a new audience. Anne's character appeared again, fictionalized once more. Her name, her face, and that one night in 1955 were back in public conversation. Even after death, the scandal kept following her. In the end, Anne Woodward died as she lived, surrounded by luxury but haunted by whispers. She escaped a courtroom conviction but never public judgment, and long after the headlines have faded, her story still asks the same question: was it justice, or just power protecting its own? So, what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.